When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
Enclosed, you will receive copies of communications from the commissioners appointed to make overtures of peace to the hostile Indians in pursuance of the stipulations of the 9th Article of the Treaty of Ghent. The President is confident that you will cooperate with all means in your power to conciliate the Indians, upon the principles of our agreement with Great Britain. Acting Secretary of War Alexander J. Dallas to General Andrew Jackson, 12th of June, 1815.
Friends and brothers, you know me to be your friend. You remember when your nation listened to the advice of bad men and became crazy by the prophecies of your wicked prophets, raised by the machinations of Great Britain and Spain. You remember I destroyed your enemies, put those wicked prophets to death and to flight, and by the capitulation and treaty at Fort Jackson, gave peace to your nation. Friends and brothers, I hear with sorrow that some of your people have been listening to the wicked talks of Colonel Nichols again, and that he has directed you to oppose the running of the line agreeable to the Treaty of Fort Jackson. Brothers, listen. Did I ever tell you a lie? Listen. I now tell you, that line must and will be run, and the least opposition brings down instant destruction on the heads of the opposers. Brothers, listen. My men are ready to crush all the enemies of the United States. I am your friend and brother. Andrew Jackson's Talk to the Creeks, the 4th of September, 1815.
For anyone who knows anything about Andrew Jackson, you're probably thinking exactly what I am in response to our first opening quote. Good luck with that one, Dallas. Even this early in his career, Andrew Jackson was many things, but a conciliator, he was not. Before we delve too much into that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Special thanks to Vince of the Autocrat Podcast and Dustin from the Alexander Standard for reading the opening quotes for this episode. On Autocrat, Vince and his co-host Cassie explore Roman history starting at the very beginning of what the Romans would have considered history, the creation of the gods, and how the Trojan War would lead to the founding of Rome, and on through its 1,000-year history until the fall of the Eastern Empire. They've still got a ways to go, but it's been a fascinating journey thus far, so I highly recommend checking out Autocrat wherever you get your podcast. In an equally audacious historical quest, Dustin and his co-host Meredith are reviewing, rating, and ranking all of the successors of Alexander the Great, from Perdiccas to Cleopatra VII. It's been fascinating to learn more about how all these figures and the successor kingdoms of Alexander's massive empire interacted and reshaped the history of Africa, Europe, and Asia. Might I recommend checking out the 2-part episode on Ptolemy Coronos for both an amazing narrative story and, as you might hear, a familiar voice. The Alexander Standard, like Autocrat, is available wherever fine podcasts can be found. I'll have links to both on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, and we'll be sharing information about both on my social media around the release of this episode.
You don't wake up dreaming of McDonald's fries. You wake up dreaming of McDonald's hash browns. McDonald's breakfast comes first. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
As we've seen in recent episodes, there was much to work through in the aftermath of the War of 1812, including the state of the frontiers of the United States. Native peoples had allied with both the Americans and the British during the recent conflict, and part of the peace between the two nations held implications for how the United States should proceed with these native peoples who had warred against them. As stipulated by Article 9 of the Treaty of Ghent, quote, the United States of America engaged to put an end immediately after the ratification of the present treaty to hostilities with all the tribes or nations of Indians with whom they may be at war at the time of such ratification, and forthwith to restore to such tribes or nations respectively all the possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to in 1811 previous to such hostilities. To reach out to the native peoples of the Northwest, the Madison administration tapped someone who we haven't talked about in a bit. After resigning his military commission, President Madison had appointed William Henry Harrison to negotiate with a group of native peoples in Greenville, Ohio in the summer of 1814. Harrison was able to conclude a treaty on July 22nd in which the native peoples agreed that they would not maintain neutrality when the United States was at war with another nation, and indeed would lend their forces to the Americans when asked to do so. With the war at an end, Acting Secretary of War Alexander Dallas sent Harrison a new commission to negotiate with native peoples per Article 9. Harrison would be joined in this duty by General Duncan MacArthur and the Chief Clerk of the State Department, John Graham. Native leaders were called together in the Detroit area with a date of August 25th set to begin the Peace Council. They would ultimately gather in woods just south of Detroit at a place called Spring Wells. The native peoples had been informed by the British of the Treaty of Ghent, and with peace restored between the U.S. and Great Britain, they were eager to reach a settlement as well. This resulted in the Treaty of Spring Wells on September 8th, which, quote, required no cession of tribal lands and agreed to restore all previous possessions and rights. Previous treaties were renewed and confirmed. We'll see as we go along in this presidential series and the next how this works out for the native peoples. But matters in the Southwest were a bit of another story. As discussed in episode 4.31, the Treaty of Fort Jackson that had ended the Creek War was completely lopsided in the Americans' favor, just as the driving force of that treaty, General Andrew Jackson, had intended. After having gained around 22 million acres of land for white settlement, Jackson had no intention of letting the Treaty of Ghent undo his treaty, British or no British. During his final days in New Orleans after ending martial law, the point at which we left him in episode 4.36, Jackson was joined by his wife Rachel and their adopted son Andrew, and they attended a grand ball in his honor before they began the journey home. After being the guest of honor at a grand banquet in his honor in Nashville on May 22nd, Jackson was able to settle in at least for a little bit to home life at the Hermitage. By the late summer, though, Jackson was back on the trail, heading down to the former Muskogee lands from which they were supposed to be vacating, but upon hearing news from the British that their lands would be restored by the Treaty of Ghent, they were still on. Once on the scene, Jackson delivered talks to them along the lines of the second opening quote, threatening military action once more if they didn't abide by the terms of the Treaty of Fort Jackson. In the late fall, Jackson traveled to Washington, D.C., officially to receive the kudos of a gracious nation for his military successes. But you can also imagine that he had plenty to say to the politicians there in the midst of their feting him as a hero. Jackson made it clear that he would use his newfound fame to advance his goals, including, but not limited to, the preservation of the Treaty of Fort Jackson and the opening up of vast tracts of land for settlement. Meanwhile, in the far western American settlements, the governors of the Illinois and Missouri territories had been charged with convening the first ever treaty council west of the Mississippi in order to abide by the terms of Article 9. The governors, Ninian Edwards of Illinois and William Clark of Missouri, respectively, were joined by a third commissioner, a St. Louis merchant named Auguste Chouteau, and the three settled on a village named Portage des Sioux, where the Missouri and Mississippi rivers came together as the site of the council. The meeting began on July 10th, as described by Clark biographer Landon Jones, with, quote, the sounds of rolling drums amid a visual panorama of clashing cultures on the prairie. The U.S. regulars had lined up their 100 tents in precise rows. Patrolling the rivers were the armed galleys Governor Clark and Commodore Perry. Surrounding the Americans was the colorful panoply of dwellings and canoes of some 2,000 Native Americans, all reflecting their distinct tribal customs. Eastern tribes like the Kickapoo and the Potawatomi built bark or mat-covered lodges and traveled in graceful white birch canoes. The mounted nomads of the plains erected bison-hide teepees and used heavier dugout canoes suitable for the Missouri's powerful current. Unlike the negotiations in Greenville back east, the first treaty would be signed on July 22nd, but the council at Portage des Sioux would continue on until the end of September. Ultimately, 13 separate treaties would be signed, and $20,000 of gifts would be distributed to those native peoples who had participated. The commissioners had been given strict instructions to not seek land cessions, but when the commissioners were approached by the Iowas and Piankashaw about a land deal, they wrote back to Washington advising, quote, to accede to their proposition. At least at this point, the Madison administration declined the offer. When the Senate ratified these treaties on December 26, 1815, it became the first time that, quote, tribes on the upper Mississippi and Great Plains had pledged peace and placed themselves under the exclusive jurisdiction of the American government. There were, however, still some holdouts. The Menominee, Ojibwas, Saukes of Rock River, and Winnebagos had not sent representatives. No matter, the West was growing ever more secure for white settlers, and Americans were determined to have peace with all the tribes, one way or another. With matters in the West being attended to, the Madison administration had to turn to one of the largest lingering issues from the war, namely, how the government was going to pay back all the debt it incurred during the conflict and help to restore the national economy. That's where the new Treasury Secretary, Alexander J. Dallas, came in. Soon after taking office, on October 17, 1814, Dallas released his plan for the restoration of the nation's finances, which included a proposal for the chartering of a new national bank. As Dallas knew that the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Representative John Wales Epps, Democratic Republican from Virginia, was opposed to the rechartering of a new national bank, and that he enjoyed a certain bit of gravitas from being former President Jefferson's son-in-law, Dallas did something that we haven't seen much of to this point. He personally testified before both House Ways and Means as well as the Senate committee in his push for the bank proposal. This push seemed to have worked, for on November 7th, Ways and Means reported out, quote, a bank bill along substantially the same lines Dallas had proposed. If he had any illusions that opposition was at an end, however, Dallas was soon to see that wasn't the case. Someone who we haven't discussed too much yet, but who was quickly becoming a rising political star at the time, Representative John C. Calhoun, Democratic Republican from South Carolina, put forward his own bill to charter a national bank. Calhoun's version, however, would greatly limit government influence over the bank and vice versa. Federalists and supporters of Representative Epps both rallied behind the Calhoun proposal, and it seemed like it may move forward to passage. Dallas sent word to Calhoun's fellow South Carolinian congressional colleague, Representative William J. Lowndes, that Calhoun's plan was, quote, impractical and dangerous, and that only the bank along the lines he had proposed would have the capability of solving the nation's financial woes. Whether an intentional part of his strategy or an unrelated beneficial turn of events, rumors started to circulate that, though still relatively new to the post, Dallas was threatening to resign. The Niles Register of Baltimore published a story about this rumored resignation, asserting that, quote, "We hope Dallas does not. He seems just such a man as the people want." A bill for a national bank along the lines of Dallas's proposal was passed by the Senate in early December and was sent back to the House. However, the House put this bill aside, and another member of the House came forward with another alternative bank bill. Another figure that we haven't talked much about yet, but, spoiler alert, will rise in national prominence. Representative Daniel Webster, Federalist from New Hampshire, objected to Dallas's proposed $50 million in capital to launch the bank with, and instead felt that the $10 million that Alexander Hamilton had suggested for the original Bank of the United States was enough. Webster's proposal also limited the bank's ability to lend to the federal government, denied the government a say in the bank's board of directors, and would not allow the new bank to suspend specie payments, a power that every other bank had in order to protect themselves from insolvency. Webster's proposal quickly passed in the House and Senate and was sent to Madison for his signature. While some in Congress had disagreed with Webster's proposal but saw any national bank as better than nothing, Secretary Dallas viewed this proposed bank as absolutely untenable and dangerous. Meeting with the president about the matter and laying out his arguments, Madison was convinced to issue only the fourth veto of his presidency on January 30th, explaining that the bill, quote, did not appear to be calculated to answer the purposes of reviving the public credit and affording to the public more durable loans. And there the matter sat, as Congress, transitioning to a post-war state, refused to act with any sense of urgency on Dallas's proposed bank. So the Treasury Secretary had to spend the next year implementing stopgap measures to keep the government going and doing outreach to banks across the nation in an attempt to convince them to resume specie payments in order to strengthen the national economy. Meanwhile, the end of the war saw a revival of plans in New Orleans for filibustering expeditions against the province of Tejas in particular and Mexico as a whole. Despite the failure of the Gutierrez-McGee expedition in 1813, as discussed in episode 4.29, some of the same figures involved in that failed attempt to establish Texas independence were still hopeful that they could turn the tide and try again. Still, there were some of the key figures in the 1813 failure that, though they expressed an interest in joining up once more, that the new conspirators had no desire to be involved again, chief among those José Alvarez de Toledo, who was blamed for the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Medina. Rather, the filibusters were looking for new partners, and they found folks at least willing to hear them out in the form of the brothers Lafitte. Jean and Pierre Lafitte, formerly the leaders of the Pirates of Barataria Bay, found themselves after the War of 1812 at a bit of a crossroads. While, as discussed in episode 4.36, a deal had been reached to get a formal pardon from the federal government for their past criminal activity in exchange for their support of the defense of New Orleans, freedom did not necessarily bring prosperity. As historian William C. Davis noted, quote, "The brothers were not in financial difficulty to be sure, but with their sources of income interrupted, they had to watch their expenses. The federal government had seized some of their property, including ships, and at this point, they were without a fleet. If they were to get back into the game, they had to secure new ships, one way or another." While they intended to appeal to leaders in Washington for restitution for their seized property, they also wished to hedge their bets. Thus, Jean traveled east to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. He would find no support for compensation in official circles in the nation's capital, but he would have more success in securing a new vessel in Baltimore, which, as noted by Davis, quote, was on the verge of becoming more important than New Orleans as a seedbed of filibustering activities against Spain. By this point, the murmurs of new filibustering schemes had reached the federal government, and President Madison took what action he could. At a time that the administration was working to restore relations with the government of Fernando VII of Spain, Madison and his cabinet wanted to keep Americans in line. Thus, on September 1st, 1815, the president issued a proclamation reporting that, quote, information has been received that sundry persons, citizens of the United States, or residents within the same, and especially within the state of Louisiana, are conspiring together to begin and set on foot, provide and prepare the means for a military expedition or enterprise against the dominions of Spain, with which the United States are happily at peace. Madison warned against this violation of Spanish sovereignty and, quote, enjoined and required all officers, civil and military, of the United States to be vigilant, each within his respective department and according to his functions, in searching out and bringing to punishment all persons engaged or concerned in such enterprises. Internal filibusters were not the only threat to a full restoration of Anglo-Spanish relations, however. As discussed in episode 4.24, since the execution of Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla in 1811, the cause of Mexican independence had been championed by Father Jose Maria Morelos y Pavón. However, the movement had lost some of its momentum, with some of the wealthy criollos in Mexico, quote, becoming alarmed at the radical twist the revolution seemed to be taking. Still, Morelos was able to develop, quote, a small but effective army that relied primarily on guerrilla tactics to keep the enemy off guard, and devised a plan that he was able to execute, which, by the spring of 1813, had cut off Mexico City from both coasts. Morelos then issued a call for a Congress to assemble in Chilpancingo, and this Congress formally declared independence, as well as laid the groundwork for a progressive constitution calling for universal male suffrage, the abolishment of, quote, slavery and all caste systems, the abolishment of government monopolies, a 5% income tax, and the abolishment of judicial torture. That was the high water mark for the Morelos-led independence movement. General Felix Maria Calleja del Rey was able to push back on the rebel force to break the encirclement of Mexico City, with Calleja's force even capturing Chilpancingo, the city that 6 months prior the Independence Congress had assembled. Increasingly, the Congress and Morelos found themselves on the run, and in the fall of 1815, Morelos fell into the hands of Spanish authorities. After being found guilty of treason, he met the same end as Hidalgo on December 22, 1815. Morelos was, quote, shorn of his religious vestments and executed by a firing squad. Before its ultimate collapse, the independent government of Mexico had had an opportunity to send a diplomatic minister to Washington, D.C. in order to convince the Americans to join their cause. However, as news of the setbacks to the independence movement reached officials in the American capital, they were reluctant to intervene or even recognize the diplomat, especially as the State Department moved forward with official recognition of the Spanish minister who had been acting as more of a shadow minister since his arrival in the U.S. in 1809. With the collapse of the Napoleonic regime and the restoration of an independent Spanish government, Luis de Onís y González Vara was ready to present his diplomatic credentials to President Madison. With this completed in December 1815, work could officially begin to resolve the issues between the U.S. and Spain. News of one other development in Latin America indicated a possible resurgence of Spanish authority in the Western Hemisphere. As discussed in episode 4.17, Cartagena, a city on the northern coast of modern-day Colombia, had declared its independence from Spain in 1810 and had become a center of privateering activity in the Caribbean, issuing letters of marque to nearly anyone and everyone, including the Lafitte's, which gave their piracy an air of legitimacy. Given that the primary target of privateers in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico had been Spanish ships, the restored Spanish government quickly turned their attention to Cartagena, and in early October 1815 began a siege with gunboats off the coast. The siege lasted for 106 days, but finally, with people inside the city starving and with no relief anticipated for its defenders. In December, a fleet of 14 privateers and merchantmen set sail, and the city surrendered to the Spanish. As battles raged in other parts of the hemisphere, Treasury Secretary Dallas on December 6, 1815, resumed his fight for a new national bank with a report to the first session of the 14th Congress. Dallas had tried throughout the year to pressure the banks to resume specie payments, with no luck. Thus, in this report, he stressed that a national bank was needed in order to give the government additional leverage to resolve the issue. Funny enough, in this session of Congress, he found that he had an unexpected ally. Representative John C. Calhoun had come around to the Dallas proposal and used his position as chairman of the House Committee on Currency to help the legislation through. By this point, Henry Clay had returned from his diplomatic service abroad and, after securing re-election to the House, had also resumed his position as Speaker of the House. Though Clay had originally been reluctant, he too by this point was a staunch proponent of Dallas's bank. Webster still held firm in his opposition, but the tide had turned, and after passing through both houses of Congress, on April 10, 1816, James Madison signed into law legislation creating what would come to be known as the Second Bank of the United States. Though there were constitutional issues brought up in the debate over the chartering of the new national bank, they differed greatly from the debates over the original bank and the decision to not recharter it. While those had focused on Hamilton and the Federalist arguments that chartering a national bank was constitutional under the necessary and proper clause in order to manage the federal government's finances, given the nature of the circumstances of the time, the debate over the second bank centered around the coinage clause of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority, quote, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. We must remember that this was a time before a national paper currency. Money as they understood it was hard currency, metal coins. As it was impractical to carry around lots of metal coins, banknotes operated in much the same way as our paper currency does. However, the banknotes were only as valuable as the ability to redeem them for metal coins. And at this point, banks across the United States had stopped redeeming banknotes in order to avoid a run that would drain them of the metal coins, or specie, that they had in their reserves. No specie, no bank. The nation was at an impasse. Thus, proponents of the new national bank argued that chartering the national bank was constitutional, as Congress had the authority to regulate the value of money, and the bank would allow them to, quote, restore gold and silver coin to circulation. Hence, why you had James Madison, the ideological partner and inheritor of the political legacy of Thomas Jefferson, agreeing to the chartering of a national bank after leading the charge against it during the Washington administration. It would take a while for a new bank to come together organizationally and structurally, so we'll leave that for the moment and wrap up this episode. Though they were nearing the end of the Madison presidency as 1815 gave way to 1816, there were still plenty of twists and turns ahead before the end of Madison's term, as we'll discuss next time in an episode I'd like to call The Year Without a Summer. Until then, thanks so much again to Dustin from the Alexander Standard and Vince from the Autocrat podcast for providing the intro quotes for this episode. Be sure to check out both of their amazing podcasts wherever fine podcasts can be found. Special thanks also to Christian of Your Podcast Pal for his audio editing work on this episode. If you'd like to enlist Christian services for your podcast, check out his website at yourpodcastpal.com. Thanks to the folks at the Colonial Music Institute at George Washington's Mount Vernon for graciously allowing us the use of clips from Hull's Victory as performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand for our intro and outro music. You can find out more about the great work that the Colonial Music Institute is doing to research and share information about early American music and dance by going to mountvernon.org and typing in Colonial Music Institute in the search field. I'll have links to all these available on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. presidencies.com. There, you can also find sources used in this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and links to much more information about all the American presidents. You can also find out how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidencies podcast. Whether it's through a rating and review, or if you sign up as a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/presidencies, I cannot thank you enough for your support. Please feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions or comments at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
This is Peter.
And this is Tom.
We want to tell you guys a little bit about our podcast. Tom and I met in college, became best friends, and then teachers almost 20 years ago. Sometimes school just does not allow us to elaborate on the topics that we find interesting, like the real shark attacks that inspired the movie Jaws, or the real historical context to Indiana Jones artifacts. Where does cereal come from? Or are zombies real? Does Ben Franklin really deserve to be on a $100 bill? On our podcast, just like in our class, there are no stupid questions.
Just two friends having a lighthearted conversation about history, pop culture, and the context of current events.
Listen to History Teachers Talking Podcast from Evergreen Network, anywhere you get your podcasts.